and welcome to Arkansas Tech's Emergency Management Doctrine class. Yes, that is a beach that you're looking at. And why would we be talking about a beach in relation to emergency management doctrine? Well, we're going to speak specifically of allegory of the beach. Why? Well, first of all, what type of thinking should you use in college? Critical and creative thinking. Also, people learn in relation to what they already know. So, what's an allegory? Well, it's a type of analogy, a metaphor. The moon is like cheese would be a good example. So, an allegory is simply a metaphor extended into a story. We all know what a story is, right? So, it's something we already know. Now, do you think an allegory is used to explain something simple or complex? It's used to explain something complex. So, for example, you've probably heard of Plato. In about 380 BC, Plato wrote the Republic. And in that long writing, Plato wrote the allegory of the cave. Suffice it to say that it is a story, a very simple story about a cave and people walking to the light outside the cave. And it's all about a complex philosopher's journey. Now, let's fast forward 2,400 years. Do you think emergency management doctrine is simple or complex? Yes, it is complex. In fact, we have an entire course to cover it. So let's dive right into our allegory of the beach. What might that be? It looks like a straw or a stick, perhaps, or maybe it's a pole that represents whole community. Whole community is an important component of all of emergency management doctrine. Now, we're going to start with preparedness. At the top of our whole community pole, we have the umbrella, the overarching umbrella, preparedness doctrine. Presidential Policy Directive 8, or PPD 8, set out most of our doctrine that we'll be discussing. Now, as part of PPD 8, there's a national preparedness goal. And part of that goal is comprised of 32 core capabilities. Now, let me just jump aside for a second and talk about historical comprehensive emergency management. It's all hazards, 4 phases, correct? Well, we have a little bit of a new spin on it, but you're not going to be getting caught up in the argument whether we have phases or mission areas. You're just going to know the core concepts and proceed with your emergency management. So what we have is a national preparedness system, and that's where you can think of funneling those 32 core capabilities through that system to identify risks and capabilities that are required. And then what you do for the community is review and update those capabilities. So as a result, you end up with your mission areas. So we have preparedness, we have response, recovery, and mitigation. Also, we have prevention and protection, and those came post 9/11. Those are geared toward terrorism. Now, your mission areas or your planning frameworks, you're basically the phases by any other name. So you still have preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation, and then you tack on prevention and protection. Also, you have federal interagency operational plans, or FEOPs. That's what happens at the federal level. So just be aware that those are there. Now, we are going to first meet the response sisters. This is Stafford. She's a little snooty. She's a lawyer. She's a law. Now, she stands upon 2 key things you need to remember. A presidential disaster declaration. If you don't have one of those, then you don't have a Stafford Act disaster response, and you would have to look to other resources. But once there is a presidential declaration of an emergency or a disaster, then FEMA comes into play, and disaster locations can receive public assistance and individual assistance. So with Stafford, you need to remember that it's a presidentially declared disaster and that individual assistance and public assistance come under the Stafford Act. Next, we have one of the sisters that was created by Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5. George W. Bush made that presidential directive, and it created National Incident Management System, or NIMS, and that is a flexible, scalable system for responding to any type of disaster or event at a small level and all the way into a multi-regional disaster or incident. Now, NIMS is built upon ICS, or Incident Command System. That is the structure that NIMS is built upon and expands upon. The next sister we have under Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5 is the National Response Framework, NRF. The NRF stands on emergency support functions. So emergency support functions, 14 or 15 different functions that fall under the National Response Framework. And different agencies are in charge of different support functions. Of course, we love our acronyms, ESFs for emergency support functions. Next, we have the Recovery Brothers, and this is long-term recovery. You might think of him as Longfellow. Now, long-term recovery stands on the National Disaster Recovery Framework, or NDRF. Also standing on the NDRF is short-term recovery, Shorty. And then we have a third brother. Now, this third brother is mitigation, or MIT for short. And mitigation stands on the National Mitigation Framework. Why is mitigation there with the Recovery Brothers? Because they go hand in hand. Mitigation and recovery are married, so to speak. Next, we have what I mentioned earlier, we have protection and prevention frameworks, and those came about because of terrorism, and they address terrorism issues. Now, you might be wondering what's this down at the bottom. Well, that represents the sands of time, or a timeline of sorts. And then, what might these be? Okay, those are your weeds in the sands of time, which represent major disasters. And those major disasters are what led to emergency management doctrine. Now, you saw this fella over here who's been looking really bummed out the whole time. Well, why would that be? Well, he represents a gap in the emergency management doctrine. Why is he smiling now? Because of you. Because what you're going to do is discover the gaps, help fill them, and results in improved community disaster resilience. The end.